Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. We've got a really great event lined up for everyone today. In case you are not certain you're in the right place, I'm Catherine Putz. I'm the managing editor of The Diplomat, and I'm very excited to be moderating today's conversation, which is going to focus on discussing what happened about a month ago when violence erupted on the Kyrgyz-Tajik border. The border and increasingly critical infrastructure along the border has long been a source of tension between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, particularly local communities that live along this undemarcated border. Late April saw some of the worst violence that area has seen in really recent times. And to help us grapple with what happened and outline what happened last month, I'm very happy to be joined today by two excellent journalists from the region, Anahita Saymidinova from Tajikistan and Aigerim Turgunbaeva from Kyrgyzstan. They've both been reporting on the border, so they're going to be able to talk us through what happened last month and how the events were perceived in both countries. And then Madeleine Reeves from the University of Manchester is going to talk us through the background context and really put in context the recent clashes and maybe touch on why tension has escalated in recent years. And then we're going to be able to turn to question and answer. So as you listen to our panelists, please send any questions that you have through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We'll go through those. Each panelist is going to speak for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to be able to have about half an hour good discussion. So please do send us your questions. And that's obviously enough for me for now. So I'm going to turn the conversation first to Anahita. So please tell us what happened last month and what you witnessed while reporting on the border. You need to unmute yourself. Thank you.
Yes, sorry, I didn't get used to the Zoom call. Okay, good morning, Washington, good afternoon, London, and good evening, Central Asia, Bishkek and Dushanbe. Thank you, Katie, for inviting me to join this discussion because it's really important for us in Central Asia. So what happened on April 28, 29, we know that the border clash, it was something unprecedented. It's a very old conflict, but this time so many people died. I mean, so many wounded, like thousands of people were displaced, houses were burned. First time when I read about this in the news, I decided to contact the Foreign Ministry of Tajikistan in order to ask whether the journalists can come to this zone or not. I actually went to the border region on May 1st. We stayed in Isfara, it's a city in the northern part of Tajikistan, and the next day we traveled to the villages near the borders. But for people who are outside of Central Asia to understand, it's a very complicated border issues because when you are in a region where people live, you can see like one house of Kyrgyz, one of Tajik, and it's very complex and very, yeah, it's really complicated. So when we went there, the struggle as a Tajik journalist we were 6 of journalists there, it's about the statistics. Because what we saw from the other side, Kyrgyz journalists, they reported how many people died and all the statistics numbers, but from our side, we didn't have any statistics. Really, it was somehow strange because when we talked with the military, they asked us to contact the administration of Sud region, you know. So no emergency committee, we have the committee on emergency, so we didn't see anyone there. And it was like we started visiting people who suffered from this conflict, and we saw burnt houses, but you could count them, it's 10 houses burned, and it's like a lot of trauma. And we went to Voruch. It's part of Tajikistan, like surrounded by Kyrgyz territory. People really, when I talked, they said that it's a, you know, we lived in fear so many years. I mean, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And this time, because we are tired, we want the governments of both countries to solve this issue. As many people who watch us, they know, because it's all about the land, access to water, land, pasture, you know. So it's only one message I got from these people who live there. And it's a huge trauma for people to live so many years, you know. They were telling me the stories that sometimes you are crossing a road and from the Kyrgyz side, they can come and beat you. I don't know, so many this type of clashes between the local population. One more thing I wanted to say, why the Tajik media, we were really weak, because I contacted my colleagues, nobody went to that part of Tajikistan, and many, you know, in Tajikistan, of course, we have limited access, and maybe many journalists, they thought, oh, now because it's a conflict, it's more dangerous to go and report about it, because sometimes you touch some very easy topics, you can't report about it, but it's kind of a huge conflict, and I don't know. But the other things, the consequences of this conflict, what we can see now. Now today, even today, in the news, it was reported that how the Kyrgyz side, they are using the airport just to, you know, this conflict, it's not only about the border now, and it's the relationship between two countries are really like hostile now. It's not good at all, but we are neighbors, and like 200 almost passengers, they came back from Bishkek because at the airport, they didn't allow them to come back to Kyrgyzstan. I think many Tajiks, they live and work in Bishkek. We have this type of retaliation, and it's not healthy as well. And what also I wanted to point out about the militarization of the border, it's also something, it's very concerning us. Because 2 days ago also it was reported that the Kyrgyz parliament, they want to pass a new law, to amend the law and to give weapons to local residents. And I don't think it is something positive, because it's when you give weapon to a local population, and every time, because still 450 kilometers not demarcated, and also we didn't solve this issue at high level. Of course, the ceasefire was signed on May 1st, but even after the head of Tajikistan visited Moscow, and also the president of Kyrgyzstan visited Moscow, you know, because every time in Central Asia, when something happens, usually, traditionally, the leaders of the country, they look at Moscow as a mediator. And now we can see that nothing changed. We have this ceasefire, but it's really very strange situation now, because something is going on. And I'm back to Dushanbe, and I'm contacting people there. They're saying it's quiet now, but some very, you know, not good feeling is going on. So this is from my side.
Thank you very much for that. Aigerim, do you want to talk to us about what you witnessed while reporting on the border, and sort of what the Kyrgyz view on the situation has been?
So I made some notes, and I won't talk about politics. So at first, hello, dear participants of the discussion. First of all, I'd like to thank the diplomat and Katie for organizing this meeting, which is so important for the Central Asian region. So let's get straight to the point. The chronology of clash in the Kyrgyz and Tajik media is slightly different. So I'll try to give you a timeline from Kyrgyzstan's side. It began with the fact that the Tajik side tried to install surveillance cameras on a pole near the water intake station, so allowing to track the distribution of water. The Kyrgyz side was outraged and began to cut down the pole. As skirmish began, the participants of the conflict began to throw stones at each other, and after a while, shots rang out. So on April 29, at about 5 p.m., the Tajik side opened fire on 3 border outposts, Kapchigai, Mimbulak, Dostuk, as well as on 2 border posts, Kojogar, Bulakbashi. It responds to the actions of the Tajik security force, the Special Force Unit Buru, captured 1 of the border outpost, Koja Yalo of Tajikistan. Tajikistan launched a massive attack with mortars, machine guns, and submachine guns at the Головной water intake. And the question is how they ended up armed at this level remains open. The use of such weapons by the Kyrgyz side appeared much later. The fighting took place on the territory of Kyrgyzstan. As a result, more than 170 residential buildings, schools, kindergartens, and social facilities were destroyed. About 50,000 people were evacuated from the villages of Kyrgyzstan. So they were mostly women, old people, and children. Their homes are partially or completely burned down. So according to the Ministry of Health and Social Development, 36 civilians were killed, 3 soldiers and 33 civilians. You could also see in the Kyrgyz media photos of the dead children, 12-year-old Madina and 4-year-old Abidin. And more than 180 people were injured. The fact that the military actions were not spontaneous is also confirmed by the fact that simultaneously with the offensive in the conflict zone near the village of Koktash, the Tajik army began shelling the villages of the Leylek district, which is almost 100 kilometers from Koktash. Tajik military attacked border post and detained 10 hostages, including the head of the village International Mirzabek Jumabayev. The Tajik authorities denied this fact, but then hostages were returned. The Prosecutor General's Office of Kyrgyzstan recognized the actions of Tajikistan as military aggression. I would like to note that at the time of the invasion of the Tajik army on the territory of Kyrgyzstan, key officials of the country were away. The head of Gökhanbe flew to Germany on April 28 for treatment after heart surgery. Prime Minister was in Kazan for a meeting of the Eurasian Intergovernmental Council, and Defense Minister at a meeting of the Council of Defense Minister of the CSTO member states in Dushanbe. So literally from the first days of the escalation, some media outlets began to cover what was happening not quite objectively, and on April 30, in an emergency order within 1 hour, I guess my team and we flew to Batken. And an information vacuum was created inside the country, and the official press services of the presidential and government offices were silent. And there was a threat of misinformation which would worsen the situation. So on the evening of April 30, the roads were officially opened, and Tajik military had to leave the territory of Kyrgyzstan. On May 1st, I and my team left for Leylek district, and the road to Turkucha was completely littered with shelled cars. We were at the Головной water intake too, and we were warned then that the Turkucha intersection has been recaptured by the Tajik military. And we decided go through anyway, but suddenly a drone appeared, and then the shooting started in our direction, and we were the only moving car on the road, and when the bullets flew, we turned back. And let me remind you that it was on May 1st, after the negotiations and the announcement that the Tajik military had left the territory of Kyrgyzstan. So in the evening, the heads of GKNB of Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan decided on a complete ceasefire and withdrawal of troops. As we later saw, not only civilian vehicles were held, but also we saw ambulance who went to the scene to provide assistance to the victims. So no humanitarian aid vehicles could get there. And as the Red Crescent informed me, they already wanted to send medical supplies by air. And by the morning of May 3rd, the parties had completed the withdrawal of forces from the border into their territories. So I was able to get into Ledik district. And of course, it was a shock. It feels like I don't know, tornado of fire has passed. Later, unexploded shells and aircraft missiles were found in houses, gardens, and it was very difficult to talk to the locals. They were almost all terrified, and many people now receive psychological help as well. So in the first hours of the attack, with the use of mortars and other army weapons, 24 civilians were killed in the Головной. Visually, this section of road looks like this narrow road and high mountains on both sides. So the civilians were an open target, and they were killed in just half an hour. So I spoke with the young man who was in the Головной with his father, and his friend was killed on the spot, and his father was wounded. He says it was completely unexpected. Bullets flew, people rushed into the scattering, and someone just dropped dead. Arkady Dubnov, an expert on Central Asia, says Dushanbe simply could not have mobilized so much military equipment so quickly without prior training. The Tajik army dug trenches. It's special holes on the ground for the soldiers, and in advance, and they drove all its power to the border. Tanks, helicopters that dropped in unguided aircraft missiles, armored personal carriers, and grenade launchers. And I spent 2 days going to the place where the evacuees were placed. And, the children were very frightened, and at the sight of strangers immediately ran to their mothers. And the woman also looked very frightened. To talk to them, I had to explain at length that I was not the enemy. And only a few women spoke briefly about the incident on camera, because I wrote some articles for media. Kamchibek, a resident of the village Arka, expressed great regret and interview because his teachers were Tajiks, and he has many Tajik neighbors. As you know, in some villages, the houses of Kyrgyz and Tajiks are arranged staggered order. And he assured that the common people had once again become a toy in the hands of politicians. So I will refrain from making assessment that may be perceived as political. So, and of course, we should not forget about recommendations of international organizations such as Human Rights Watch, OSCE, and United Nations to stop resolving issues by force. And 19 Tajiks and 36 Kyrgyzstans were killed, and both of sides buried their dead on the same day. I, as a teacher and as an ordinary citizen, I'm sure that it is necessary to resolve this issue by diplomatic means in compliance with international law. There are a lot of wars in the world where hundreds of people are killed, and until each of us takes a step towards each other, does not give in to each other, does not begin to respect the neighbor, friend, colleague, every person, every life, regardless of religion, color, language, cultural, people will die. So I think that's all. Maybe you have questions.
Thank you, Aigerim. Before we get to questions, remember everybody, you can send your questions through the Q&A function. I want to turn to Madeleine to kind of put what happened in context. Why is this stretch of the border? Maybe walk us through some of the infrastructure that has served as sort of these flashpoints, and what you found through your research and your work about the borders in Central Asia. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to Katie for the invitation to take part into The Diplomat. I'm really glad that this incident is getting international attention. And I also just want to acknowledge the work that Anahita and Aigerim and other journalists have done in trying to illuminate objectively what has happened. And I think their experiences and their testimony speak to just how dangerous that is very often at a personal level. And I also just want to express my condolences to all those people who've lost loved ones and livelihoods in the conflict, and to all those families that are still displaced or still unsure whether they'll ever be able to return to a place that feels like home. We've only got 10 minutes to speak, so there are really two big points that I want to make in my intervention, which I hope build on this, I think, important description that Anahita and Aigerim have given of this sort of immediate context. And my first is about the significance of what happened at the end of April, and it's, in a sense, its ongoing social and political ramifications. Because although this webinar is framed in the past tense, sort of what happened and focusing on the events at the end of April, I think it's important to recognise that, in a sense, there are many issues here that remain unresolved. And as Anahita mentioned, we have at the current time, a Somon air flight that was returned from Bishkek to Dushanbe early this morning, border closures and so on. So it's an ongoing, I think, very tense situation. So in terms of understanding the significance of what happened, I think it's important to recognise that while this started as a border incident, it's important not just to see it in a sense as a straightforward continuation of previous border tensions, although it's shaped and informed by those, but as an interstate conflict. And one that has been amplified, I think, in different ways by the particular forms and styles of leadership that we see in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, the styles of governance, the different configuration of the public sphere, and the political media and journalistic landscape that we see, in Kyrgyzstan on the one hand, with one of the most volatile political landscapes in the post-Soviet space, but also with a relatively vibrant media landscape on the one hand, and Tajikistan on the other, where the current president, Emomali Rahmon, has been head of state since 1992. And I think that sort of political context is really important for understanding both the dynamics of what happened and the potential sort of future ramifications. And the second point that I want to make relating to, in a sense, the significance and the scale of what happened, that I think makes it, I think it's fair to say, unprecedented so far in the nature of boundary disputes that have happened in Central Asia in the post-Soviet period, is, in a sense, the delocalization of conflict. So while the conflict in the Isfara Valley started at the Galavnoy water distribution facility, much of the damage to property and the loss of life took place on a completely different part of the Kyrgyzstan-Tajikistan border in Leylek. 70 kilometers as the crow flies, and many, many more kilometers than that if you have to sort of reach one part of the border from the other. And it's also significant that, for instance, many of the young men who lost their lives at the Galavnoy water facility were not from Aksai or from Koktash, from the villages immediately surrounding that facility, but were from, in a sense, downstream villages, downstream from the Turkul reservoir, which depends on that water distribution facility, from Bujum, from Batken town itself, from Kızılbel and so forth. And I think this is significant in two senses. First, it shows how localized disputes can escalate extremely rapidly, right, in the age of social media, through the real-time sharing of news, of video footage, of people calling each other to say, come, we're under attack, come and help. And the sort of the upstream downstream relationship there is very significant, because the whole of Batken town and a significant surrounding area depends on irrigation water from the Turku Canal, but also because I think it demonstrates, in a sense, a delocalization of conflict also at the military level. That there is now a sort of a tendency to treat a localized incident in one area as grounds for violent retaliation in another area. So that's my sort of first point, is I think as a sort of an analytical community, as a scholarly community, and as a community of kind of concerned citizens and non-citizens, it's important to sort of recognize the significance and the scale of what happened, and its ramifications more generally for peaceful resolution of boundary disputes more generally in Central Asia. And my second point relates to, in a sense, I guess what we might call sort of levels of analysis or scales of analysis in trying to make sense of what has happened. And my sense here is that I think explanatory accounts of what have happened, and it will take, a great deal of careful investigative reporting and to really sort of understand the microdynamics of what happened. But I think there's a tendency either to focus on the immediate precipitating factors, of which we've already heard about some, the mounting of surveillance cameras by the Tajikistan side to monitor repair works on the Galavnoy distribution facility, some things that haven't been mentioned, the increasingly tense exchange of words between Kyrgyz and Tajik officials in the preceding weeks, particularly around the status of Varukh, and in a sense, I think that the significance of the change of power, the change of regime in Kyrgyzstan, the role of Kamchibek Tashiev, and the kind of way in which he made border issues central to the articulation of a certain kind of populist politics in Kyrgyzstan. And then the role of sort of the militarization of the border, and the role of military exercises and so on. So there's on the one hand these immediate sort of proximate causes or constitutive factors, if not causes. And I think those have received quite a bit of attention on the one hand. And then there's a tendency, I think, to focus on what we might call the deeper past, right? To look back to, border drawing in the 1920s, or to land exchanges that happened in the Soviet period, or to the loaning of infrastructure, the resettlement of populations, historical disputes over water, of land, pasture use. Now, I think both of these things, I'm not wanting to downplay by any means the significance, in a sense, either of those proximate precipitating contextual factors, or of the long-standing durational things. But I think what tends then to happen is that we perhaps bracket out some of the important transformations that have been happening in this region over the last 10 to 15 years, I would say in particular since 2014. And it's that in my last few minutes, I really want to focus on. That's also the period in which I've been conducting research in and along the Isfara Valley. But I think some of the transformations that have been happening here over this period are really important to understand how what seemed perhaps from the outside like a localized dispute over infrastructure could escalate so quickly. And there are 5 things that I'm just going to run through here really briefly, aware of the need to save time for the Q&A. First is sort of, in a sense, the increasing militarization of this region and the increasing presence of military personnel in daily life, who I think for local populations can create a feeling of sort of existential fear. Anahita mentioned her interlocutors in Varukh saying, we're tired of the kind of existential anxiety of being, you know, stopped and asked for documents or of stone throwing and so on. So I think there's this sort of, in a sense, been an escalation of force over this period. Second, I think on both sides of the border, there is a sense, or has been a sense, of a lack of political voice. And sometimes that the only way in which your experiences can be heard by those in power, whether that's in Bishkek or Dushanbe, is at times of conflict. This is something that I heard on both sides of the border. Third, and I'm sorry that I'm running through these in a very bullet point fashion, but for the interest of brevity, I think there's been a politicization of cross-border infrastructure, by which I mean there's been attempts to build infrastructure that in a sense creates bypasses, that bypasses the neighboring state, that allows people to travel from villages, say, in the Isfara Valley on the Kyrgyz side of the border to Batken, the regional center, without having to cross through Tajikistani territory. And this again has this sort of impact of kind of creating, you know, the road becoming a de facto border. And I think it's not insignificant that Turkuchu, which literally means, you know, crossroad, right, four roads, has become a kind of epicenter of conflict, because in a sense now we have a situation where one road goes to Tajikistan, one road goes to Kyrgyzstan. This wasn't the case previously. In the mid-2000s, it was possible to take a bus from Batken to Varukh that went through all of the intermediary villages. And I think this relates then to a fourth point, that this militarization of a landscape in the context of a lack of juridical determination and a politicization of cross-border infrastructure undermines spaces of everyday cross-border interaction and conviviality, marketplaces, public transport, paradigmatically, water pumps, mosques, medical points, religious mosques and visits to religious healers, kindergartens and so forth. And that's, I think, the transformation that we've seen over the last 10 to 15 years is an undermining of these spaces of everyday cross-border convivial interaction. And fifth, combined with this, I think there has been a defunding of the transboundary structures that might foster that everyday cooperation, particularly among young people. I remember a comment from an EU diplomat in 2015 that they said, oh, conflict prevention, you know, that's so last decade. Now we're bothered with radicalization and so on. And I think, I mean, although that may sound facile, I think there is a sense in which there has been insufficient attention paid to both a juridical resolution of boundary issues and a moving of those issues into the diplomatic sphere. There's been a sort of an attempt to resolve issues de facto through the building of infrastructure, while in a sense constantly deferring the legal and political regulation of boundary disputes. And at the same time, there has been a sort of an undermining, I think, of these spaces of everyday convivial social interaction, which might mitigate in times of dispute escalation, that might creating kind of countervailing tendencies. Now, none of that is to dispute the fact that has been mentioned that this was, you know, as I said, a dispute of a radically different order. And I don't want to sort of somehow imply that with a little bit more conflict prevention, somehow this military dispute could have been prevented. But I do want to draw attention to, I think, this progressive militarization of daily life over the last 15 years and the impact that has had in places like the Isfara Valley. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Madeleine. That was very helpful. And looks like we have Anahita back. So we're ready for questions and answers. So if you do have questions, please put them into the Q&A, or if you're on YouTube, you can add them to the YouTube channel and we'll see them there. But since I'm running this show, I get to start first. And what my first question is really for everybody, but in your mind, what would be necessary to make progress both on demarcating the border and then making the lives of the people in this region easier, because it certainly sounds like an extremely stressful situation. There's, myriad reasons people start arguments, and sometimes that becomes larger conflicts. So what would be necessary to make progress on the demarcation issue and then translate that into on the ground changes for people? Does anybody want to jump on that one?
So maybe, yeah, I don't think this is really in my area of expertise. This should be resolved within the framework with agreements that were signed by the heads of the State Security Committee at the time of the conflict. And of course, the agreement that existed before in the framework of bilateral relations, as well as those that were within the framework of regional organizations, of which both Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are members, should be strengthened, I think. And so that.
Madeleine, do you have any thoughts about how progress could be made?
Sure. I mean, I think in terms, because there are two parts to the question, but I think in terms of the issue of sort of delimitation and demarcation, I think first of all there needs to be the political will to actually really resolve these issues, and that demands recognizing, I think, on both sides, that there will need to be compromises, and that there needs to be a recognition, in a sense, of the sort of the existential interests of the other side, right? The existential significance for the whole of Bashkir region, and indeed for the whole of Kyrgyzstan, of having guaranteed irrigation in the Turkul reservoir. On the Tajikistan side, the existential significance for people in Varok of having free access that is unimpeded to their regional center in Isfahan and so on. So it requires an element of sort of political will. I think at a technical level, it's going to be incredibly complex. And I think a lot of the statements that, we're going to have a sort of meetings, high-level meetings, and that we'll resolve these border issues in a matter of days, I think is completely sort of unhelpful in a sense. It's going to be, it will, in a sense of necessity, given the historical disputes over the location of the boundary, and indeed of the degree to which populations have grown since the last parity committees were conducted, is one that will mean that it's going to be a long and slow process. So I think there needs to be the political will, there needs to be a significant amount of technical capacity to do that. And I think that requires thinking outside the box. I mean, one of the suggestions that I've made in the past is that, there have been border disputes, ongoing border disputes, say, between India and Bangladesh, involving the Kuch Behar enclaves. What would it involve? What would it mean to involve technical expertise from outside the region without immediately looking towards Russia, for instance? I think the importance of involving local people. One of the sort of repeated grievances that I heard during my research was that local people felt that often parity committees were conducting their action, were having negotiations that didn't involve local people, that didn't sort of come and consult with them, and to bring sort of local people from different demographic groups into those discussions, and not necessarily to assume that they should be conducted in either Bishkek or Dushanbe or Moscow, but what would it mean to conduct those discussions locally? What would it mean to do those in a forum that involved the local publics? So I think there's a series of moves there, and then I think there are a series of moves that can be made to really strengthen the existing locally existing mechanisms for conflict mediation and conflict resolution. And again, that shouldn't be somehow some sort of, tokenistic events of, oh, let's hold a volleyball match between young people from Koktash and Hojailo or something. That should be, these need really, careful long-term and long-range kind of work.
Thank you. So the next question comes from a couple of people who have asked a variation on this, so I'm going to summarize it. What has been the Russian role in either mediating this conflict, or really are the Russians taking sides? And a similar question was asked regarding China. Does China have any stakes in this conversation? Curious about kind of the international involvement, or might be lack of involvement. Anahita, do you know?
Sorry,
I know you're having internet issues.
Really bad, and it happens when your servers are in Kyrgyzstan, because and it happens when you have a conflict with your neighbors. That's why I'm like, yeah, for your previous question regarding how to solve it, I think we need a very good mediator for this conflict. And as many Tajik experts say, we have the maps, because both sides, as Kyrgyz, as Tajik side, we have different types of maps from the Soviet Union, and the Tajik side is insisting to use the maps from the 1924, 1929, and the Kyrgyz side is insisting to use the maps from the 1950s. I think this is an issue where they should come up to one conclusion, which maps to use. And it was announced that even the Kyrgyz side agreed to use the maps from 1924. So the other question is of obligations and how these agreements will be reached, and will people, border guards, the locals, they will follow all these agreements. One thing is to sign a paper here in Dushanbe or Bishkek. The other thing is when people live there, how it will be implemented on the ground. The other question I missed you about China and Russia, sorry.
Yeah, what has there been a Russian role in mediating the conflict, or sort of any involvement of outside powers, and what kind of stakes they might have in this issue, or maybe they're not interested?
Of course, as I said previously, the Russian role is really important. As we can see, the high-level officials of our country, they visited Moscow, and it says a lot, because traditionally Russia is our kind of deciding what to do. On military side, Russia is still controlling the Central Asia, and China is more economic, and maybe in the future it will be also military. But one thing is important to understand, that we have this long border with Afghanistan and unstable Afghanistan. I don't think for Russia it is something they want to have a conflict or something in their region. They are, interested to control. And as Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, we are members of this collective security treatment organization, CSTO, and I think it shouldn't be in any conflicts between the countries of this organization. It's a military organization. And as Putin supported only through diplomatic means, as he said that this conflict should be resolved through the diplomatic means, I think so Russia can play a very vital role. But it's a different question whether Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, because we are an independent countries, how it will be again implemented here. The other thing about China, I didn't see any announcement from the Chinese side. They are usually quite very, careful to intervene into internal affairs of the countries. But I think the focus of these regional players are most on Afghanistan, because China has its own problem with the western part. I mean, with this the so-called Islamists and all what is happening in Afghanistan and the US decision to leave the country. Also, Russia is also interested to have a safe central, stable Central Asia. So that's why we don't need any new conflicts in this region. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Anybody else have any perspectives on either Russian involvement or Chinese non-involvement? Okay, I'll move on to the next question, which I think is a pretty simple one, and I can kind of guess what some of the answers are, but I think it'll be good to highlight, can this issue, which seems to be, at least in part, centered around Bork, the exclave, the Tajik exclave in Kyrgyzstan, can it be solved by land swaps, territory shifting, and why not? I know from my reading and from my reporting on this, that's a very touchy subject, but I think it's something people from outside the region, when you look at a situation like this, just change territory and then you can have a simple border. So maybe if you could touch on why that's not a primary solution, or maybe if anybody thinks it is, you can make that case.
So I can answer this question. I think as a pragmatic person, I think a land swap is something should be done. But as you can see, if you monitor the social media in Tajikistan and in Kyrgyzstan, like people have a very strong feelings. And even I said many people didn't visit Vorukh, but they have a very strong, it's more related to your, country, patriotism. This is all nationalistic sentiments. That's why it's even quite difficult for the leaders of two countries to decide, because it's mostly about the people's mood. It's about the concession to give. And I don't think not in Tajikistan, not even in Kyrgyzstan, they want to do it. And that's why it's a question, like I saw a lot of post, it's like Vorukh, it's part of Tajikistan, and it's a very strong sentiments, because Kamchibek Tashiyev, the head of the KGB of Kyrgyzstan, before announced that maybe it was just a maybe, but in Tajikistan, and I mean in virtual, like social media, people had quite strong reactions that we don't want to give Vorukh to Kyrgyzstan. But it was just, maybe of Tashiyev gave such a strong feelings from inside of Tajikistan. That's why I think it's something really quite difficult. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
Madeleine, do you have any background on the history of land swaps and that kind of solution?
I think there's a tendency sometimes to assume that firstly, that a land swap will resolve everything, right? That if we can just, exchange an equal area of territory, that this will resolve things. I think that's a very easy perception to have when you are distant from the situation. But as Anahita and Aigerim have both alluded to, in a sense, the topology of this region is incredibly complex. The population density in this region is incredibly high, right? So I don't see land swaps, particularly in inhabited areas, in a sense, as resolving anything. And I think they don't, in a sense, when there is this sort of over determination of border issues as somehow, if we could just switch land, this would resolve things. I think this diverts attention from actually, again, those existential questions. What do people need here to be able to make a life, right? They need a certain degree of physical security. They need economic possibilities. They need water. They need to be able to feel that they can farm their land without that being threatened. They need peace. They need to be able to access local markets and so forth. So I think, starting from an approach to finding solutions that actually starts from the kind of lived complex realities of people's lives, rather than sort of starting from, again, this sort of attempt to go back to a sort of a year zero, in a sense, and because I think that will just, borders are intrinsically political. That will just create endless space for more dispute, and I don't see that, in a sense, as resolving things. I think you have to start with people's material lives and their existential needs and their physical and psychological security.
Thank you.
So remark, I think. So I think that the rapid options for resolving border issues that are being considered over the next few years are very dangerous. How will the local people of both sides perceive the exchange of land? And to what extent does such a decision correspond to the interest of the state? And if you look from the point of view of, I don't know, security outside of economic interests, how much is the need for this studied? What are the pros and cons? Such work should be carried out very carefully. Therefore, this issue could not be raised for, I don't know, discussion maybe. So because we saw the reaction, and it is, I don't know, very difficult questions. So I think.
Thank you. So the next question touches on some of the causes of instability in the region and really the world as we go forward. Climate change. Do we think that sort of drought in the region, less water and access to water is going to continue to be a trigger for these kinds of conflict? Anybody want to sort of talk about the environmental sort of triggers for some of the stress in the region? Anahita?
Yeah, definitely. This is a good question, because during my interview with a teacher from one of the villages near the border, he pointed out and it was interesting to hear his perspective, because he didn't blame the Kyrgyz side. But he said because of climate change, the resources are scarce, and we want to have access. The Kyrgyz side, they wanted also to have access to water, land. And it is something very concerning, because he said, in the past, I mean, during the Soviet time, we didn't have such problems, but now the population is increasing. Mm-hmm. So many, as we said, so many people live in the Fergana Valley, and it's a good land, I mean, to live there. And that's why I think that will be more people, less resources, and because of climate change, of course, water is something very valuable. Yeah.
Thank you. Madeleine?
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, I agree. I'm wary of being, in a sense, sort of determinist about it, but I think, because I think it's also very much about the politics of water distribution and about the politics of water management, in a sense, as well as the transformations that are happening to climate, the glacial melt on which which is necessary for the Isfara River. So I think there are all of these things that are working in tandem. But certainly, I mean, there are scholars doing some very, very good work, I think, looking at sort of environmental stresses on transboundary water use. And I think it is, I mean, I haven't done research on this specifically myself, but I think it is impacting, on levels. And I think, these are things that are also compounded by population growth, as has been mentioned, the COVID crisis, and the fact that the sort of outmigration to Russia, which was previously, in a sense, a sustaining feature of life here, and acted as a mitigating strategy for households when in contexts of irrigation shortage, right? And this is a region where people are highly dependent on artificial irrigation for their agricultural crops, for apricot orchards, and so on. That sort of labor migration acted as a kind of as a release valve in those situations where you had a bad harvest. So that has been removed. So I think it's a kind of complex sort of political economy of water that we need to pay attention to.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with Madeleine. It's very complex. I think it should be.
Okay, so I think we've got time to hit one last good question, and I think this is a good place to kind of bring it to. How will this most recent conflict affect the long-term relations between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan? Does this differ from past sort of border conflicts, and is this either sort of the crisis that everybody backs away from and sort of moves towards a more constructive approach, or do you see this as just kind of the next iteration of conflict with the potential of worse conflict to come? So the impact on long-term relations between the two countries. We can start with Anahita.
Yeah, just I wanted to say regarding how this conflict, it was different because of social media as well, as Madeleine pointed out. I totally agree, because we had some cases, even Kyrgyz communities in Russia with Tajik, they had a clash. Like, you know, it reminded me a bit of Azeri and Armenian conflict, where it was about communities in Europe, America. It affected them, and people had a lot of hatred towards each other. I think this time is really different. You can feel it, and even on, not only on social media, as I said about this plane. So many people now, they can't go to Bishkek, or they're afraid to travel to Kyrgyzstan, because I also studied at OEC Academy in Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan. But after my reports on Twitter, it's like I'm thinking twice before traveling there. But I really hope that this conflict will be solved, and it's not about emotions now, but in order to have good relationship with our neighbor. I mean, in Tajikistan, I talked to many experts, to local people. They don't have any hostile kind of attitude. But you know, social media, it's kind of a platform where it can be good and it could be very bad of fluing this type of, as a put some video and just acting, or just asking people to have this kind of emotional, you can see a dead person, all this stuff. It's, of course, I think from Tajik side, people died as well. They suffered. I told about trauma, but it's a question how to report it. Is it necessary to, you know, sometimes journalists, they can provoke more hatred. That's why I think it should be less emotional and more constructive discussions between two nations. Thank you.
Thank you. Aigerim, do you have any reflections on sort of the long-term impact of this conflict?
I want to answer Anahita about social media and about information, maybe war. Some experts said that it was information war. So I would not say that there was an information war, because most likely there was an information vacuum, I think, which led to a difference in data on both sides. So as I mentioned earlier, there was a vacuum at the beginning of the conflict, and there was different data from different sources. So then the situation improved, but as the editor of Radio Ozodi mentioned on Twitter, officially authorities of Tajikistan did not give information promptly. So, and I think it was not just information. It was not information war. I think it is just because it was information vacuum. So, okay, there is though. And I agree with Madeleine about her pitch about that the questions very complicated, so, and very difficult, and we can't I don't know, decide in just 1 hour this problem which we have here in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, because we see this situation and not objectively. I think I see in Kyrgyzstan side, and Anahita see all what happening in Tajikistan side, and I think we are I don't know, we are here to understand the situation and try to help from our side, not to worsen it.
Madeleine, do you have any perspective on sort of the long-term implications of this conflict to close us out?
I mean, I think it's a great question, and I think it is, in a sense, the million-dollar question at the moment. And I think it could, we could look at sort of tendencies on optimistically and pessimistically. I think optimistically we can say, well, there has been a shift towards talking in more diplomatic terms, of recognizing that there needs to be a move towards delimitation and demarcation, of solving border issues, and there is at a discursive level an emphasis on finding peaceful solutions and so on. So I think that is significant, and I think the fact that however we may view its role, the fact that Russia and indeed Uzbekistan, which we haven't mentioned, have sort of expressed a desire to help diplomatically and so forth. I think we need to recognize that, and the fact that the situation could have escalated in unimaginable ways in early May, and and that has been contained. However, I think there are also more concerning signs, discourses of sort of we need to arm border populations, we need to create border militias and so forth, I think don't help to de-escalate the situation. And I think de-escalation is a preliminary to any kind of peaceful resolution of this situation. Again, I mean, I go back to the point that I made, that we need to kind of start from people's existential sense of security, to feel that they can return to their home, or to feel that, that Anahita can return to Bishkek, and thousands others in analogous situations, on both sides of the border. And I think a huge amount there will depend on the particular kind of domestic politics and the role that this conflict comes to play out in sort of state-society relations. And on that respect, I think the social life that this conflict has taken on for people who are very removed from the border areas geographically and in a sense socially, but for whom this has taken on a kind of a sense of deep personal humiliation. I think that is significant in terms of the way that may play out in terms of domestic politics, both in Kyrgyzstan for Japarov and Tashev and their concern to show that they are taking a firm stance on border issues. And and in Tajikistan, with the sort of the political configuration there and so forth. So I think it remains to be seen what the sort of long-term rollout of this will be. But I certainly hope that there will be a diplomatic solution, and a solution that really recognizes and acknowledges the forms of local knowledge and local expertise, and the importance of incorporating those into any durable solution.
Well, thank you very much. I think that's a great note to end on. I just want to say thank you very much to everybody around the world who joined us, and especially our panelists, Anahita, Aigerim, and Madeleine. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences and your work with us, and hopefully we'll see each other soon, there, here, everywhere. Thank you very much, and have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Madeleine, Alfie.